Don't think, but look. When investigating meaning, a philosopher must look and see the variety of uses to which the word is put. We are led astray by our words' uniform appearance into speculating about their meaning. Wittgenstein reiterates, don't think, but look. And such searching is conducted with regards to specific circumstances and not generalizations. Any explanatory generalization should be substituted out for a description of use when defining a word's meaning. It is in this quote that Wittgenstein asks us to look through the superficial boundaries that we in society have set upon ourselves and go against the grain, just as how he challenged the notions of other philosophers such as Frege and Saint Augustine in his book Philosophical Investigations. Next slide, please. So, pleasant day to everyone. I am Geoffrey Mañalac II.
And I am Chaz Garcia.
And we are Group 8. Today, we will be discussing to you our analysis on Ludwig Wittgenstein's book, Philosophical Investigations.
But before we proceed, we would like to show an overview of today's report. It will consist of 4 parts, namely, Introduction, Part 1, Part 2, and the conclusion/summary. In the introduction, we will be showing a glimpse of Mr. Wittgenstein's life, what he went through, his ups and downs, highs and lows, and what his book is about. In this part, we will also be introducing one of the major concepts Mr. Wittgenstein makes and elaborates on in his book. First, who is Ludwig? Wittgenstein was born on April 26, 1889 in Vienna, Austria, to a wealthy industrial family, well situated in intellectual and cultural Viennese circles. In 1908, he began his studies in aeronautical engineering at Manchester University, where his interest in the philosophy of pure mathematics led him to Frege. Upon Frege's advice, in 1911, he went to Cambridge to study with Bertrand Russell. Russell wrote upon meeting Wittgenstein, "An unknown German appeared, obstinate and perverse, but I think not stupid." During his years in Cambridge from 1911 to 1913, Wittgenstein conducted several conversations on philosophy and the foundations of logic with Russell, with whom he had an emotional and intense relationship. He retreated to isolation in Norway for months at a time in order to ponder these philosophical problems and to work out their solutions. In 1914, at the start of World War I, which spans from 1914 to 1918, he joined the Austrian army. He was taken captive in 1918 and spent the remaining months of the war at a prison camp. It was during the war that he wrote the notes and drafts of his first important work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. In the 1920s, with Wittgenstein, now divorced from philosophy, having, to his mind, solved all philosophical problems in the Tractatus, gave away his part of his family's fortune, and pursued several professions: gardener, teacher, architect, etc. in and out Vienna. It was only in 1929 that he returned to Cambridge to resume his philosophical vocation. It was during these first years that his conception of philosophy and its problems underwent dramatic changes that are recorded in several volumes of conversations, lecture notes, and letters. Sometimes termed the myth of Wittgenstein, this period holds a rejection of dogmatic philosophy, including both traditional works and the Tractatus itself. In the 1930s and 1940s, Wittgenstein conducted seminars at Cambridge, developing most these included the turn from logic to ordinary language, novel reflections on psychology and mathematics, and a general skepticism concerning philosophy's pretensions. In 1945, he prepared the manuscript of the philosophical investigations, but at last minute withdrew it from publication and only authorized its posthumous publication. For a few more years, he continued his philosophical work, but this is marked by a rich development of, rather than a turn away from, his second phase. He traveled during this period to the United States and Ireland and returned to Cambridge, where he was diagnosed with cancer. Legend has it that at his death in 1951, his last words were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life."
All right. To follow that interesting life story, we will now be introducing the four major concepts that we found in his work, Philosophical Investigations. These are language games, family resemblances, ostensive definitions, and lastly, naming. So first is language games. In this concept, language sort of operates like a game, where words function as moving game pieces. For example, when someone tells you to do this and you do something that's defined by what that person said, so there's a connection between what the people say and do. So it's intriguing to compare language and games in a hypothetical sense. Another interesting idea that Wittgenstein presents is that games have no essence. So if I were to ask you what a game is, how would you describe it? Like what particular characteristics make it a game? So if you say that it's when pieces are moved across a board, I could counter that with, what about basketball? If you say that it's when two or more people compete against each other, what about solitaire? Or if you say all games are for fun, then what about war games, right? Are those for fun? So you see where we're getting at? Under every condition that you say a game is, there will always be another game that doesn't fit that specific condition, but is still considered a game. And just as we are unable to provide a conclusive definition of game, we are also unable to determine what is common to all these activities and what transforms them into languages or parts of languages. The idea of language games draws attention to the rule-governed character of language. This doesn't imply that this doesn't imply strict and precise systems of rules for every language game, but rather emphasizes the conventional nature of this kind of human activity. Language games are both countless and context-dependent. The language games, for example, that are being played in a room full of physicists are different from the language games that are being played by players in a basketball court. So when playing a basketball game, we usually encounter the terms such as pass, dribble, shoot. So terms such as electron, neutron, and isotope wouldn't really make sense in that scenario. And it would be just the same if the situations were reversed. If different language games were mixed, it would only result in ineffective communication.
Now, let's move on to part one, where we will be discussing language. First part, Augustine Confessions. When they, my elders, named some object and moved accordingly towards something, I saw this and I grasped that the thing was called by the sound they uttered when they meant to point it out. Their intention was shewn by their bodily movements, as it were the natural language of all peoples. The expression of the face, the play of the eyes, the movement of other parts of the body, and the tone of voice which expresses our state of mind seeking, having, rejecting, or avoiding something. Thus, as I heard words repeatedly used in their proper places in various sentences, I gradually learned to understand what objects they signified, and after I trained my mouth to form these signs, I used them to express my desires. Here, Ludwig tells that by observing how they, his elders, use words to point out objects, even without knowing their meaning, he eventually found out what they signify, and from that, he used those words to express himself. Now, this is a primitive language of Augustine, of which there is really no meaning to words, just objects they signify. Basically, here, language is learned through an action of referring to something. When we say water and point to water, or when we say table and point to a table. Ludwig asks us, is this truly what we call language? And then he goes further on to compare it to a script where instead of letters having different function, a person only sees those letters as having only one function. Like notes, these letters or words have only a correspondence to a certain sound, and these sounds serve to evoke images inside our minds.
Okay.
It gives another experiment, which is the shopkeeper thought experiment.
So next, Ludwig gives us a situation where, what if the person doesn't know what the words mean, only the letters and symbols that correspond to those words? So the shopkeeper who opens the drawer marked apples, then he looks up the word red in a table and finds a color sample opposite it. Then he says the series of cardinal numbers. I assume that he knows them by heart up to the word 5. And for each number, he takes an apple of the same color as the sample out of the drawer. It is in this and similar ways that one operates with words, that one operates with Augustine's view of language. So when someone orders apples, they give the shopkeeper a note that says 5 red apples. When handed the note, the shopkeeper looks for a drawer marked with apples, the sign, and opens it. He finds what the color red looks like using the color samples and counts up to 5, which is the amount of apples he takes. Now, this is very similar to what Augustine's view of language is, and that's how we use signs in order to refer to objects and words. And so Wittgenstein asks here, but what is the meaning of the word 5? See, its meaning does not really correspond to any object, only to its use. Its meaning is a method of doing something rather than a reference to any particular thing. Counting all the way to 5. And this will be Wittgenstein's first reference of the idea that perhaps the significance of language isn't determined by the existence of a sign reference link, but rather by a correlation that exists between the way that we use our words. So next we have the builder's language. So the prior thought experiment has philosophical implications for us. What does it mean to have meaning? So in keeping with the Augustinian view, which was previously described, Wittgenstein offered here a simple depiction of how language works in its most primitive form. So let's envision a language that in the most basic sense truly adheres to the claim that language is nothing more than a collection of correlational signs to objects. Wittgenstein gave an example named the builder's language. Now in this example, Wittgenstein wants us to imagine that there are two builders, builder A and builder B. And the way that they work is Builder A shouts out a word, and Builder B hands him the object that the word corresponds to. The list of those words are blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. So when Builder A shouts beam, Builder B brings a beam. When Builder A shouts pillars, Builder B brings a pillar, and so on and so forth. Now, although this language isn't as complex as the ones we use today, this can already be considered a complete primitive language based on the Augustinian view that words simply act as signs that correspond to objects.
Now, these ideas, experiments, really point to the idea of ostensiveness. Here, Ludwig gives a quote. An important part of the training will consider pointing objects, giving the child's attention to them, and at the same time uttering a word. Here, Ludwig gives a quote. For instance, the word slab. As he points to that shape, I do not want to call this ostensive definition because the child cannot yet ask what the name is. I will call it ostensive teaching of words. I say that it will form an important part of the training because it is so with human beings, not because it could not be imagined otherwise. This ostensive teaching of words can be said to establish an association between the word and the thing. Here, Wittgenstein says that actually, now, the purpose of a word for this place isn't to evoke images. It's so that they evoke action. Here, since the children don't know how to speak yet, instead of calling this the ostensive definition of a word, where you signify a new reference, he calls this the ostensive teaching of words, where you point at something and ask the child to use the word how you use it. Now you see that, or you may have noticed that every time we talk about what ostensive is or what it relates to, we always say pointing. We'll get to this in a bit. Now next will be section 7 of I shall also call the whole consisting of language and the actions into which it is woven, the language game. Here, Ludwig asserts that language is something that is integrated into us by our actions. Our actions dictate the language that we speak, way of life, the life we've lived, what we've done. And in these language games, they require not only participation from us, but also from another person. So now you start to understand and get an idea that the concept of a language is not really an individualistic one, but it now starts to turn into a social one.
All right. Next, Ludwig demonstrates to us how we might expand language. So here he gives us the words this and there. Next, he combines these words with the concepts he provided to us before. Language used in the shopkeeper thought experiment and between the builders, the slab there, this blue pillar there. So how do we show the use of this and that? We do that by pointing to a location or something, right? Now, the problem then comes when we try to answer what is the meaning of pointing. So what is its use in language? So what makes it so that pointing gives us a clear idea or a definition of what this and that mean? That's why it becomes difficult to teach this and that ostensibly, because we do the action of pointing in, not just trying to point to the thing that these words signify, but in using them as well. All right, words functions. As we all know, words have several uses, and in the book, Wittgenstein compares the word's uses to the uses of tools in a toolbox. So let's read this section. Think of the tools in a toolbox. There is a hammer, pliers, a saw, a screwdriver, a rule, a glue pot, glue nails, and screws. The functions of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects, and in both cases there are similarities. Of course, what confuses us is the uniform appearance of words when we hear them spoken or meet them in script and print. For their application is not presented to us so clearly, especially when we are doing philosophy. So he also used the example of looking inside a locomotive's cabin. He claims that you will see all of these levers, which to the mechanically inexperienced would appear to look identical, right? And from that inexperienced person's perspective, they are unaware of the difference between one thing and another. Now, Wittgenstein asserts that this is what takes place when we confront language. It's the idea that language's significance ultimately comes down to how it's used. However, because there are so many various ways to employ words, we are prone to trying to turn language's complexity into some kind of straightforward framework, a single, all-encompassing structure that shows how all words' uses are related to each other.
To signify. Along with using tools, here Ludwig states that when we say every word in language signifies something, we have so far said nothing whatever, unless we have explained exactly what distinction we wish to make. When we say that word signifies something, this doesn't really tell you much apart from just what they signify. Ludwig further asserts this point by giving an example of how tools modify other tools, like how a hammer modifies the position of a nail. When we try to define what a hammer means by saying, "Oh, a hammer modifies the position of a nail," now the saw, the shape of the board, this really only points to the modification of words itself, not the definition of a hammer. Another example that Ludwig gives us is with the color samples. When we use those color samples along with the other words, now does this mean that they are a part of the language? Yes, they are. Like how we use the word the, for example. Ludwig gives here a statement saying, pronounce the word the. Here we have an idea of what the word the means because we can see how the word the is being used. Ostensive definition. Next is the classification and order of words. Ask yourself whether a language is complete, whether it was so before the symbolism of chemistry and the notation of the infinitesimal calculus were incorporated in it, or these are, so to speak, suburbs of our language. And how many houses or streets does it take before a town begins to be a town? Our language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares, of old and new houses, and of houses with additions from various periods. And this is surrounded by a multitude of new boroughs with straight, regular streets and uniform houses. It is in this section that Wittgenstein suggests a perspective in which we should be viewing language. That language is never complete, just like how you can never determine that a city is complete. And that just like how a city is built with its streets, monuments, houses, old and new, language is also built using a combination of various forms of languages and language games that have developed during different time periods or over time. And the manner in which our language is used reflects the various areas in which we have thought about things in a variety of ways and the alternative methods of doing things.
All right. Okay. Just like there are other series. Oh, wait, never mind. Oh, again.
Yo, what is this guy doing?
Uh. Okay.
That was SpongeBob.
Just like there are other cities around the world that are being built, there are other languages and language games out there too. Other people who have heard the word that you said but may interpret it differently because the actions with which they perform this word are different from the ones you do. Now, Ludwig understands this and uh, he understands this eventuality and gives an example of how it might occur. Someone who did not understand our language, a foreigner who had fairly often heard someone giving the order, "Bring me a slab," might believe that this whole series of sounds was one word corresponding, perhaps, to the word uh, for building stone in his language. If he himself had given this order, perhaps he would have pronounced it differently, and we should say he pronounces it so oddly because he takes it for a single word. Now it's here we start to understand that not only is language something that is said, but it itself is also dynamic, changing its use and its meaning through the actions and things that a person has gone through in their life. So, along with this dynamic form of life, also comes the dynamic meaning of words. Words don't have to correspond to a meaning. Uh, Depending on the situation, a word usually is used for situation X might have a different meaning because it was used in situation Y. Now, Ludwig gives a handful of situations in which words might be used differently. So, forming and in testing a hypothesis, presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams, making up a story, and reading it, play acting, singing catches, guessing riddles, making a joke, and telling it, solving a problem in practical arithmetic, and translating from one language into another. So it's through these situations we now start to understand that when we define words through how they're used and not by what they correspond to, the number of situations where we can use words, sentences, and syllables is basically countless.
In this section, Wittgenstein asks us to imagine a picture of a boxer. Imagine a picture representing a boxer in a particular stance. Now, this picture can be used to tell someone how he should stand, should hold himself, or how he should not hold himself, or how a particular man did stand in such and such place, and so on. When you do that, you ask yourself what that particular part of that picture made you assume that that was what a boxer looked like. Was it because they have a certain weight or height or facial gesture? No, right? The assumptions are that there's a certain form of life that corresponds to it, a form of life that contains information that you have gathered through your life experiences. And these assumptions, we base them on how we have experienced our life. An interesting note that Ludwig does is he asks us, do animals have a language? We might think that animals can't speak because of the lack of their mental capacity, but it is simply because they don't use language, or we could say that their form of language isn't the same as ours. Why is this the case? It's because the life they've gone through is simply different from the one we have. This brings home the point again that a form of life is indeed the bedrock that language is built upon, because it is the thing that gives context to the use of language.
All right, naming. In this section, Wittgenstein says that we should think of naming as sort of like attaching a label to something. Uh, Instead of the name of a word defining its meaning, he says that we should think of names as more of something that's sort of attached to an object randomly or arbitrarily. The naming procedure does not make a name's meaning apparent or clear. For example, if I were to say, water, away, ow, help, fine, no. Are those names of objects? No, right? So while it doesn't relate to the object, it does relate to a scenario where I could see someone calling out something. So as we can see here, naming is a form of language in and of itself, and it cannot be reduced to simple ostensive definitions. So now we move on to the second part of the report to discuss a new concept called family resemblances and how it relates to language games.
And the result of this examination is we see a complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing. Sometimes overall similarities, sometimes similarities of detail. Wittgenstein calls this phenomenon family resemblance, where what we see as an essential common factor between games is actually a web, a family of some sort, where there is no common factor, but only similarities. This concept here ties really well into another concept that Ludwig introduced to us, which is language games. Language games are just like games in real life. Some have set rules, some don't. What makes these games different from each other is because of the boundaries and rules that the participants have set upon the game. Now, just like when you see different types of games, there are different types of language games. Overlapping, but not having a single unifying factor, as explained earlier. Now, this is all fine, but it wouldn't really make sense if the person you were talking to didn't know what a game is or what it meant. How should we explain what a game is to someone? Should we describe it to him? Should we give other examples and call them games? Would this make us know more about what a game is? Do we need to set boundaries in order to explain what a game is? This would mean setting boundaries in order to have an amount of preciseness in your description. But then your boundary would only apply to this specific scenario.
All right. So yes, how do we explain to someone what a game is? So one might say that the concept game is a concept with blurred edges, but is a blurred concept a concept at all? Is an indistinct photograph a picture of a person at all? Is it even always an advantage to replace an indistinct picture with a sharp one? Isn't the indistinct one often exactly what we need? So, playing the game, trying to define something, comes with its own rules and how one interprets those rules. It's entirely up to them. One shouldn't force their own into another. Now, this in turn causes a lot of vagueness and blur because one might not reach the answer that another wanted them to reach. Let's say, for example, if you ask two people to define what a block is, both of them might come up with entirely different definitions. Now, why is this the case? Ludwig here tries to explain that when you don't set up strict boundaries and rules, one will make boundaries and rules for themselves, causing this phenomenon. So here we have a comparison between vague and a non-vague. When you ask someone to describe a non-vague picture, what do you think is the result that you'll come up with? Right? An answer with an amount of preciseness. But what if you ask them to describe what the vague picture is? Now, suddenly you might notice that they have trouble trying to come up with an answer. Now, this is the case when we try to explain things with with no strict definition.
When we have these difficulties, Ludwig says, in such a difficulty, always ask yourself, how did we learn the meaning of this word? Good, for instance. From what sorts of examples, in what language games? Then it will be easier for you to see that the word must have a family of meanings. In trying to find out the meaning, we should look not at an absolute meaning or an essence, but in describing how this word has been used, in what situations, what context, with what prior information. In answering this question, we move from a more conceptual definition, where words are only capable of having one meaning, to a practical one, where the possibilities are endless, where we can apply words to different situations, change their meaning in doing so. That's basically all. Conclusions and summary. First, language is a city comprised of other small languages that make up its streets, houses, buildings, etc. It is something that is continuously built upon by things like language games. Second, language games are life forms that require participation and action from both parties. Depending on the context, one language game may be entirely different from another. Third, the meaning of a word depends on the situations we use that word for. Meaning is not an absolute set in stone concept, and it is dynamic.
Right. Fourth, names shouldn't be associated to just objects like words. Like words, names are dynamic. Different situations will make the meaning of names different. And last, family resemblance is a concept where there is no centralized system for language. Instead, there is a network of overlapping similarities between the various families within it. And that wraps up our presentation regarding Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. We would like to thank you all for staying and listening, and we all hope
Thank
that you
you.
learned something. So, thank you. That is all.
Thank you. Goodbye.